I never imagined a single sentence could shatter the life I had built with my wife. Yet there I was, sitting at a polished oak table in an upscale downtown restaurant with two other couples we'd known for years, when Elias said the words that pierced me to the core. God, I need a new wife. This one's broken. He said it with a laugh, as if performing a comedy routine, but the joke was cruel, and the audience wasn't laughing. Everything froze. Our friends blinked in shock. The server hesitated mid-step, and my heart thudded like it would burst. It wasn't anger at first, not the fiery, screaming kind, but a cold, sharp clarity that settled in my chest. Something inside me whispered, "This moment changes everything." I had only suggested choosing a more modest wine, a small attempt to keep the evening pleasant and reasonable. Elias's reaction, public and cutting, was disproportionate. The comment didn't just humiliate me, it was a deliberate performance for everyone at the table. I looked around at our friends, seeing the awkward glances, the hesitant forks midair, and then I felt a surge of quiet, unshakable resolve. I leaned forward and said, calmly but firmly, "So, you're single now." I didn't wait for him to reply. I stood, the chair scraping behind me, and walked out into the cool December night. I left Elias, our friends, and the dinner behind, feeling a strange mix of shock, clarity, and liberation. Weeks later, the truth became undeniable. Screenshots from Elias's private messages revealed that this public humiliation had been planned. It wasn't a careless joke, it was a calculated act, a performance designed to embarrass me while he kept up appearances. Sitting in my quiet kitchen, coffee in hand, I realized that my marriage had been carefully controlled from the shadows. My dignity, my worth, my feelings, they had been manipulated, masked by the illusion of love and humor. That night marked the beginning of the unraveling of everything I had believed about my marriage. I didn't know it yet, but my life with Elias would never be the same. I'm 32, and for most of my life, I prided myself on being practical, thoughtful, and fiercely independent. I work as an IT help desk supervisor, a job that isn't glamorous, but it pays well enough to give us a comfortable life. Elias is 34, charming, witty, with a knack for making everyone around him feel at ease. When we first met, it felt like fate, or at least that's what I told myself as I remembered the way our eyes met across the cafe, him laughing at my clumsy attempt to reach for a high shelf. Our early months were intoxicating. Elias's humor, the way he listened, the small gestures, coffee in the mornings, surprise notes left on my desk, planning weekends I didn't even know I wanted, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. We moved fast, but not recklessly. Within 18 months, we were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. I loved Elias fiercely, and I thought he loved me in return. The first signs that something was off were subtle. He would occasionally make comments that cut deeper than the playful tone suggested. A joke about my wardrobe here, a teasing remark about my careful spending there. At the time, I brushed them off as quirks, evidence of his sense of humor, or proof that he was comfortable with me. I wanted to believe the love we had could smooth over small cracks. His family adored him, but I quickly realized their approval was conditional. They expected me to be perfect in my role as his wife, attentive, cheerful, and accommodating to every whim. I had dinners with his parents and siblings, and at first everything seemed cordial. But subtle critiques, side remarks, and knowing glances started to wear me down. I'd return home wondering if I'd done something wrong simply by existing. Even friends played a part. Some would laugh at jokes about Elias's quirks, while simultaneously dropping hints about my supposed shortcomings. I began noticing patterns, little inconsistencies, and moments where Elias seemed almost performative, as if he were constantly curating my image to others while testing my reactions. I loved him too much to confront him, or perhaps I was too scared to admit that the foundation I trusted was already showing cracks. Despite these uneasy moments, we shared genuine joys. Weekend trips, lazy mornings with coffee and laughter, quiet evenings binge-watching shows, planning for the future, celebrating small wins at work. I would have defended him to anyone, declaring that he was thoughtful, generous, and my partner in every sense. But slowly, under the surface, the first seeds of doubt had been planted. Little questions that seemed insignificant at the time but would later grow into undeniable truths. It was during these years that I also began to observe his subtle manipulations, little digs disguised as jokes, casual eye rolls, exaggerated sighs when I suggested spending prudently. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was imagining slights where none existed. But my intuition, the quiet voice I had learned to trust in my professional life, began to whisper warnings I could not ignore. By the time the restaurant incident occurred, the night he called me broken in front of everyone, I had unknowingly accumulated months of these small betrayals, doubts, and dismissals. That night wasn't an isolated moment. It was the first glaring public culmination of a pattern I had failed to see clearly until it became impossible to ignore. Even looking back, I can see how every shared meal, every social gathering, every interaction had built toward that moment. The laughter, the smiles, the veneer of a happy marriage, it was all a carefully maintained performance. And I had been living in it, oblivious, until the illusion shattered in the most humiliating way possible. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A remark here, a glance there. Elias would laugh at something I said, but the laughter never reached his eyes. He'd correct me in front of friends, making me feel foolish for no real reason. At first I rationalized it. He was witty. He enjoyed teasing me. It was harmless. But the feeling in my chest, a slow tightening of tension, whispered that something was off. There were small patterns forming, like cracks in porcelain, that only became visible when light hit them just right. When we went out to dinner with friends, he would comment on my outfit choices, always framed as humor. "That's a bold sweater," he'd say, with a tone that left me questioning whether he admired it or mocked me. When I suggested something modest, an affordable wine, a quiet evening at home instead of an extravagant night out, his playful smirk felt less playful over time. Elias's family began to weigh heavily on me. His mother, while polite, would drop remarks comparing me to his ex-girlfriend or hinting at how other wives handle household decisions. His father would make jokes about how a wife should manage her finances, and suddenly I felt like every small choice I made, every attempt at practicality, was a test I was failing. I tried to laugh along, to appear unfazed, but inside a subtle unease was building like a storm cloud on the horizon. Then there were his friends. They were friendly, supportive in small doses, but I began noticing moments when their laughter seemed almost conspiratorial, aimed at highlighting my shortcomings. A side comment about how Elias deserves better, a whispered jest about my careful spending, small, almost invisible arrows that made me doubt myself. I questioned whether I was imagining it, but the patterns were undeniable. At home, the tension grew in quieter ways. I noticed Elias rolling his eyes when I suggested simple changes, a tone in his voice that carried impatience when I made financial suggestions, the way he joked about my carefulness with money. What I initially brushed off as teasing now began to feel like testing boundaries. How far could he push before I reacted? I tried to confront myself about these feelings. Was I being too sensitive? Was I overanalyzing harmless humor? I had been independent for years, capable of navigating complex situations at work, yet here, in my own home, I felt increasingly small. My heart would race when I anticipated his comments, my chest tightening in quiet dread before social gatherings or casual dinners. I recalled moments that, in retrospect, were warnings, a laugh that lingered a beat too long, a joke at my expense, an exaggerated sigh when I made a reasonable request. Each one seemed insignificant at the time, but together they formed a map pointing to a deeper discomfort, one I could no longer ignore. By the time the restaurant incident happened, the tension had been building for months. I had been living with subtle dismissals, tiny humiliations, and quiet tests of my patience. Elias's behavior had started small, almost unnoticeable, but its effects compounded until that night, the night he openly and publicly humiliated me, was inevitable. Even now, thinking back, I can see the seeds of conflict everywhere, in his humor, in the social dynamics with friends and family, in the quiet power plays that I had mistaken for love. The cracks were there all along, but I had been too close, too trusting, too willing to forgive, to see the truth until it exploded in front of me. The night of the dinner replayed in my mind with every detail sharpened like a photograph. The clinking of silverware, the muted chatter of our friends, the faint scent of roasted garlic from the entree. I remember it all. We were celebrating nothing in particular, just an ordinary evening meant to feel special, and yet it became the most extraordinary nightmare of my life. It started innocuously. Elias and I were perusing the wine list, and I suggested we stick to something reasonable, $40 to $50 a bottle, while he shot a glance at the $80 options. "Let's keep it simple," I said softly, hoping to avoid any unnecessary fuss. His response should have been benign, maybe even grateful. Instead, the words hit me like a hammer. "God, I need a new wife. This one's broken." The laugh that followed was hollow, theatrical, as if he were performing for everyone in the room. My heart dropped, the warmth in my chest replaced by a sudden icy emptiness. The words weren't meant to be private. They were a statement, a declaration of dissatisfaction framed as humor. My stomach churned, my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the table's edge, and I felt my pulse spike uncontrollably. I looked up at him, trying to find some hint that he was joking, some sign that he would take it back. There was none. His eyes were calm, calculating even, the smile still in place like a mask. Around us, the air had shifted. Our friends froze mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths. The server hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to retreat or intervene. The room seemed to shrink, walls closing in as the weight of humiliation pressed down on me. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to vanish into the floor beneath the polished table. But another voice inside me, steadier than the storm of shock and hurt, whispered, "You deserve better than this." I rose slowly, deliberately, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that felt like finality. "So you're single now," I said, each word deliberate, carrying all the cold clarity I had managed to gather in that moment. My voice didn't waver, though my heart thumped like a drum in my ears. "That solves it, then." No one spoke. Elias opened his mouth, probably to protest, to plead, to explain it as a joke, but I didn't wait. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him, the table, the friends, and the wine list behind. Outside, the December air was sharp and biting against my cheeks, but it felt like freedom. Bitter, sudden, and absolute. Later, at home, the truth emerged in ways I couldn't have predicted. Screenshots from his private social media groups, conversations I wasn't meant to see, revealed that this humiliation had been meticulously planned. Hours before the dinner, posts hinted at testing my reactions, setting up the scenario so that I would be embarrassed in front of everyone. The Instagram story, the careful timing, the laughter, all orchestrated for maximum effect. I sat in our kitchen, coffee in hand, staring at the phone, feeling a mixture of rage, disbelief, and betrayal. Elias hadn't lost control in the moment. He had orchestrated it. My body shivered, not from cold, but from the deep realization that everything I had trusted, his words, his humor, our life together, was a carefully controlled performance at my expense. My hands still shook when he called me later, frantic apologies in his voice. "Catherine, baby, I'm so sorry. It was just a stupid joke. I didn't mean it." I let him speak, let him twist and justify, but my mind was already clear. This wasn't about a joke. This wasn't about stress or misunderstanding. This was calculated. And in that moment, I knew, with unshakable certainty, that my life with Elias had irrevocably shifted. The marriage I had trusted, nurtured, and fought for was no longer what I believed it to be. The foundation had been cracked long ago, and that dinner merely exposed the fracture for all to see. I spent the rest of that night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning like a carousel I couldn't stop. Shock, betrayal, confusion, anger. All of it tangled into a knot so tight in my chest that I could barely breathe. I replayed every moment of the dinner over and over, analyzing the inflections in Elias's voice, the smirk on his face, the deliberate pause of his words. Was this really him? The man I married? The father of our future? My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the screenshots I had captured from his social media. The posts, the comments, the careful planning, it was all there. He hadn't lost his temper or spoke without thinking. He had orchestrated my humiliation. Every detail of that night had been premeditated. The weight of it pressed on me, heavier than any physical burden I had ever carried. But alongside the shock came reflection. I kept asking myself, what did I miss? Where was I blind? Was I too trusting? Too naive? Months of small remarks, subtle digs, eye rolls, playful corrections in front of friends, they all added up. I had ignored the pattern, brushed it off as humor, as stress, as quirks. And now, the culmination was staring me in the face, public, undeniable, and impossible to excuse. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't want to yell, didn't want to cry, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel completely. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth. I waited until the next morning, until he was getting ready, his voice humming in the shower. I called him into the kitchen. "Elias, we need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. My hands were clasped together to hide the tremble that betrayed me. He froze, towel in hand. "Catherine, it was just a joke," he started, eyes wide, a hint of panic creeping in. I held up my phone, screenshots displayed. "A joke? Planning to humiliate me on social media hours before dinner is a joke?" I felt my pulse thudding in my temples. "Do you have any idea how this feels? Not just the embarrassment, Elias. The manipulation, the betrayal. This wasn't impulsive. It was calculated." His face fell. His voice faltered. He tried to justify, to explain, to twist the narrative, but I heard none of it. I had already processed the fact that love alone couldn't fix deliberate cruelty. I remembered the months of subtle digs, the eye rolls, the dismissive laughter, the helpful corrections in front of friends. Each of those moments had been building toward this crescendo. I couldn't help but question myself. Was I too controlling with money? Did I stifle his fun? Was I overreacting? The rational part of me weighed the balance of our life. I was practical, yes, but I had never demanded extravagance. I had never intended to hurt him. My concern for our finances and our stability had been measured, responsible, considerate, and yet, somehow, in his eyes, my practicality had become my flaw. I realized, in a moment of painful clarity, that this pattern had existed far longer than the dinner incident. I had ignored subtle signals because I wanted to believe in the man I married, in the partnership we promised each other. But love alone, I now understood, is not enough when respect is absent. By the end of the conversation, Elias's excuses had dried up. The mask of humor and charm had slipped, revealing the calculating truth beneath. I felt a mixture of grief and empowerment, a mourning for the illusion of the marriage I thought I had, and a small budding strength in realizing I could no longer be complicit in a dynamic that eroded my self-worth. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply said, "I need time to think." And in that moment, walking away from the kitchen, I felt the first stirrings of a new self-awareness, one that recognized the pattern of disrespect and manipulation for what it was. I was hurt, yes, but I was not broken. The days that followed were suffocating. The calm after the storm of the dinner was short-lived. I had barely started processing what Elias had done when the calls and texts began. Friends and family, ours and his, felt compelled to intervene. Everyone had an opinion, and most of it wasn't in my favor. "You're overreacting, Catherine," one friend said. It was just one comment. "He loves you. You're reading too much into it." Others were more subtle, phrases like, "Maybe he was stressed," or "Don't throw away a good marriage over one night." It was maddening. They couldn't see what I had seen. The months of subtle digs, the calculated social media humiliation, the manipulation that had been building invisibly under the guise of humor. Then came his family. His mother called, her voice honeyed but firm. "Catherine, you have to forgive him. Elias didn't mean it. Marriage requires compromise, patience, understanding." I could hear the underlying judgment. "You are overstepping. You are making him look bad. You are the problem." It wasn't just words. It was pressure, an unspoken demand for me to swallow my hurt, to normalize disrespect. But the escalation didn't stop there. As I sifted through more evidence, I discovered the depth of Elias's calculated actions. Spa appointments, dinners with friends, weekend trips, expenses he had hidden or misrepresented. Credit card statements revealed thousands of dollars in spending on himself and friends, all while framing me as too careful with money, cheap, or boring. The realization hit me like a punch. He had weaponized finances to manipulate perception, to control the narrative of our marriage in both private and public spheres. Confronting him again was inevitable. I asked for the statements, went over the numbers, line by line, month by month. "Elias, how is this responsible? How is this fair? How can you shame me for suggesting moderation when you've been spending thousands behind my back?" My voice was steady, but my hands shook. He tried to justify, weaving excuses about gifts, group dinners, self-care. Every explanation was a thread in the same fabric of manipulation. You make me feel guilty for basic self-care, I wanted to scream, but I kept it measured. Basic self-care does not cost $9,000 in 3 months. Even his friends got involved. Mara and another friend appeared at our door unannounced, ostensibly concerned and ready to mediate. Their interventions were carefully staged, full of veiled criticisms of me and gentle attempts to frame Elias as the victim. "You're throwing away a good marriage over one night," Mara said, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. I felt trapped in a theater where everyone else knew their lines, but I was forced to improvise. Through it all, I began noticing a subtle shift in myself. The fear, the doubt, the instinct to forgive everything for the sake of peace. All of it started to dissipate. Each meeting, each phone call, each well-meaning intervention revealed more of the pattern I had ignored. Public humiliation, manipulation through finances, strategic social media posts, and a network of friends complicit in validating his actions. I became vigilant. I collected evidence, documented conversations, screenshots, and receipts. Each piece of proof was both devastating and clarifying. I realized that what I had thought were isolated incidents were part of a meticulously orchestrated pattern. The escalating interventions, the pressure from friends and family, the ongoing justifications, everything was designed to make me question my own perception, to make me feel irrational for standing my ground. But instead of breaking me, it made me stronger. I started keeping notes, organizing the evidence, planning how I would confront the reality I was facing. I reached out to a lawyer for initial consultation, seeking clarity on what options I had, how I could protect myself financially and emotionally. The process was exhausting, the constant emotional strain of being gaslit by everyone around me nearly unbearable, but I refused to let them destabilize me completely. In the midst of it all, I discovered the most damning detail. Elias's social media activity revealed months of deliberate planning. Posts in private groups, screenshots of discussions about testing my reactions, strategies for pushing boundaries, all pointed to the fact that this was no isolated lapse of judgment. He had been engineering my humiliation and controlling narrative for months, using humor, charm, and social perception as weapons. By the time I confronted him with this evidence, I felt a fierce calm. The storm of anger and hurt had settled into icy clarity. I understood now. The marriage I thought I had was a carefully curated performance. The escalation from jokes, subtle digs, and financial manipulation to public humiliation wasn't random. It was deliberate. And for the first time, I was no longer willing to be part of the act. It felt like the walls of my world were closing in. The guest room became both sanctuary and prison. Every sound from the main house, every laugh echoing from the living room, felt like a reminder of how alone I was in the midst of betrayal. I had friends, yes, but many had already taken sides, unconsciously or not. Even family offered platitudes that felt hollow. I realized then how isolating a marriage built on deception could be. I walked through our home, once filled with laughter and warmth, and now it felt alien. Elias's belongings were everywhere, familiar but tainted. Each shirt, each book, each small note from him seemed like evidence of a person I barely knew. And yet, the most painful part wasn't the physical presence of betrayal. It was the emotional erosion that had been happening for months, now made visible in its full, devastating clarity. I cried in ways I hadn't in years. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet sobs that shook my body and emptied my soul. The betrayal was not sudden. It had been creeping in, piece by piece, but its full revelation was suffocating. The Instagram posts, the carefully timed jokes, the financial manipulations, the social media planning, it wasn't just that he had hurt me. He had systematically undermined my sense of self, my confidence, my very understanding of reality. Everywhere I looked, I felt the sting of isolation. Friends who had once seemed supportive now offered only faint sympathy, often with a hidden judgment. Family voices reminded me of what I should do, what a good wife should forgive. And Elias, the man I had trusted with my heart, the one who had promised partnership and love, appeared to float above it all, either oblivious or deliberately indifferent to my suffering. I felt trapped in a maze with no exit. Nights were the worst. Long stretches of silence punctuated by memories of laughter that now felt taunting, of conversations that masked subtle digs, of moments where I should have known but had ignored. Sleep eluded me, leaving only the gnawing sense of inadequacy and helplessness. I questioned everything: my judgment, my strength, my worth. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining patterns where none existed? Was I too sensitive, too demanding, too much? Each question pierced deeper, echoing in my mind like relentless drumbeats. And then the anger would flare, brief, intense, but fleeting, swallowed quickly by the weight of despair. One night, sitting on the edge of our bed, I felt the full impact of it. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, my mind racing with scenarios, my body screaming for rest. Tears streamed down my face, a mix of sorrow and frustration. I whispered into the darkness, "How did it come to this? How did I allow this to happen?" The room offered no answers, only the cold truth. The marriage I had believed in was a facade. I also felt the pull of self-doubt, subtle and insidious. Maybe this was my fault. Maybe if I had been more spontaneous, more fun, more compliant, more what he wanted, he wouldn't have felt the need to humiliate me. The rational part of me knew the truth. Love cannot justify manipulation, public shaming, and financial deceit. But the emotional part, raw and vulnerable, wrestled with guilt anyway. In those long, lonely hours, I reached the lowest point of my emotional journey. The isolation, the betrayal, the strategic cruelty, it all collided into a moment of utter despair. I wondered if I would ever feel safe in my own life again. The trust I had placed in Elias, in marriage, in friendship, seemed irrevocably shattered. And yet, even in that darkness, a small, almost imperceptible voice persisted, a quiet insistence that I was not broken, that beneath the betrayal, beneath the humiliation, beneath the despair, there was still a core of strength that had not been touched. I didn't know how to access it yet, but I sensed it, faint as a heartbeat beneath layers of grief. That night, I understood one undeniable truth. The marriage as I had known it was over, and if I wanted to survive, not just endure, but truly live, I would need to find a way to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my self-worth. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, warm but uninviting, as I sat at the table with Elias's latest confession printed in front of me. The pages were thick with evidence, screenshots, receipts, and social media posts, all carefully documented over months. It was undeniable. The meticulous planning, the manipulation, the humiliation. It had been orchestrated, step by step, as if someone had written a script for my pain. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Rage bubbled up, quick and sharp. Relief followed, oddly comforting, because now there was clarity. I didn't have to guess, didn't have to wonder if I had imagined things. I had proof. The doubt that had gnawed at me for weeks dissolved into a clear understanding of reality. I thought back to the dinner, the Instagram post, the laughter that wasn't funny. It wasn't a spontaneous mistake. It was the culmination of deliberate planning. And in that realization, a profound shift occurred. No longer was I the woman who had been trapped in confusion and despair. I was someone who could see the truth, someone who could act. The turning point came when I received a text from Colt, my coworker, that morning. "Catherine, you need to see this," he had written, attaching a screenshot from a private group where Elias had shared his strategies and frustrations, long before the public humiliation. Reading the messages, I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sorrow. Months of manipulation, months of gaslighting had been laid bare in black and white. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the power that came with knowledge. I was no longer reacting blindly to his actions. I was responding with awareness, with agency. Every strategic move he had made to destabilize me now became a tool for my clarity, a roadmap that showed me exactly why I could no longer continue in this marriage. I confronted Elias that day, not with anger, but with precision. "Catherine, it wasn't meant to be this way," he said, the words stumbling from his lips. But I was calm. I had rehearsed nothing, yet my voice carried the authority that only truth can give. "It was meant to be exactly this way," I said. placing the printed pages on the table. You planned this. Months of manipulation, humiliation, controlling through money, social media, everything. And you expected me to forgive a public spectacle? His face went pale. For the first time, I saw him lose control, not with anger, but with the recognition that his carefully constructed narrative had crumbled. I continued, my voice steady. I see you. I see the pattern. And I see my worth. I will not be a part of this anymore. It was liberating. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness, they began to dissipate. I realized that stepping away wasn't an act of surrender. It was an assertion of my self-respect, my dignity, my value. I was not broken. I was not the problem. The problem had been a calculated erosion of my self-worth, and now I was reclaiming it. Later that day, I made a decision that I would not regret. I would move forward, legally, emotionally, and financially. The divorce would be initiated with clear boundaries, documented evidence, and unwavering resolve. I would protect myself from further manipulation. I would not allow Elias's strategy of control to continue in any form. As I packed the first of the boxes for the eventual separation, I felt a strange serenity. I had been at my lowest, and yet from that darkness emerged clarity, strength, and power. I understood now that survival was not enough. I needed to reclaim my life fully. That evening, sitting alone in the quiet of the house, I allowed myself a small smile. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't cruel. I was simply taking what was rightfully mine, my peace, my dignity, my freedom. And for the first time in months, I felt the faint but undeniable stirrings of hope. The turning point wasn't just about leaving Elias. It was about reclaiming myself. And as I looked at the documents, the receipts, the messages, I knew this journey, though painful, was leading me to a stronger, wiser, and more self-assured version of Catherine. The days after my decision felt surreal, almost like I was watching life unfold through a glass window. Elias had retreated into a state of disbelief. The carefully curated persona of the charming, fun-loving wife had begun to crumble under the weight of truth. Friends who had once sided with him started asking questions, noticing inconsistencies, recalling moments that now looked different in the harsh light of reality. Mara, Elias's longtime friend and self-appointed mediator, suddenly seemed distant. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now carried tension. The subtle alliances that had supported his narrative began to erode as whispers circulated. Did he really treat Catherine this way? Did he plan the humiliation? Even Elias's mother, who had insisted I forgive him, grew quiet during our last family call. The unwavering defenses that had protected him for so long were cracking. Financially, Elias faced another layer of consequence. The meticulous documentation I had gathered, credit card statements, social media posts, private group screenshots, was undeniable. He could no longer frame me as the problem in any legal or social context. During mediation, his lawyer raised eyebrows at the clear evidence of manipulation and secret spending. It was a blow to his credibility, one he hadn't anticipated, and it left him exposed in ways that extended far beyond our marriage. I moved deliberately through each step of the divorce process, ensuring clarity and fairness while protecting my dignity. I never sought revenge. The truth had already done its work. The public humiliation he had orchestrated now reflected back on him. Friends and acquaintances who had once laughed at the Instagram posts or brushed off the comments now understood the reality behind them. Slowly, quietly, his reputation began to fracture. At home, I started reclaiming my space. The apartment felt lighter, the air freer, even though it was filled with packed boxes and reminders of a life that had once been mine. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, ones who had respected me and never questioned my worth. Conversations were honest, comforting, and healing. The laughter that returned was different now. It was authentic, not punctuated by fear of judgment or manipulation. Elias tried to reach out through calls and texts with apologies, explanations, even desperate attempts at reconciliation. I read them once, then filed them away. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer needed his narrative to define my reality. I had my own. The social fallout was equally revealing. The friends who had participated in the interventions and discussions began distancing themselves. Mara, once a constant presence in Elias's life, faded from our shared circles. The network that had seemed so strong and impenetrable proved fragile when faced with truth and accountability. His influence, carefully cultivated through charm and subtle manipulation, unraveled, leaving him isolated and confronted with the consequences of his actions. I remember the day I handed the final documents to his lawyer. It was over. Not with fanfare or celebration, but with quiet resolve. I had navigated months of emotional manipulation, public humiliation, and financial deceit. I had held on to my integrity, documented the truth, and emerged on the other side with a sense of clarity and control that I had never felt before. Walking out of the lawyer's office, the city sun warming my face, I felt the calm of completion. I didn't look back. The life that had been filled with subtle betrayals and orchestrated humiliations was behind me. I had taken nothing but my dignity, my self-respect, and the lessons that would guide me forward. And for the first time in months, I breathed freely. I could make decisions without fear of judgment, laugh without the shadow of manipulation, and live without the burden of someone else's carefully constructed narrative. The fallout had been swift for him, but for me, it was a quiet affirmation. Truth has power, and self-respect is non-negotiable. In the weeks that followed, I began to envision a life rebuilt on my own terms. I invested in myself emotionally and professionally, reestablishing routines and passions that had been sidelined. Friends who had truly valued me returned, offering support without intrusion or judgment. And though the echoes of the past remained, they no longer held sway over my sense of self. The marriage, the humiliation, the manipulation, it was all behind me. And yet, the lesson it imparted was indelible. Standing firm in truth, recognizing your worth, and refusing to accept calculated disrespect are the first steps to reclaiming a life of dignity and peace. Sitting in my quiet apartment, the hum of the city outside, I finally felt it. A sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The chaos, the betrayal, the manipulation, they all belonged to the past. I had emerged from the storm not broken, but whole, stronger than I had imagined. The hardest part wasn't the divorce itself, it was the realization of how long I had tolerated subtle erosion of my self-worth. The jokes, the eye rolls, the financial deception, the social media humiliation, they weren't just momentary lapses or stress-induced mistakes. They were deliberate, and recognizing that truth was both painful and empowering. I learned to trust myself again. My instincts, once questioned and doubted, became my compass. I knew what was acceptable and what wasn't. I understood that love is not a performance and that respect is non-negotiable. Anything less is a compromise of self, not a compromise of partnership. There were days of grief, of remembering laughter and shared moments with Elias, but each memory was tempered with clarity. I didn't hate him. I no longer needed to. I simply acknowledged reality and moved forward. My energy was no longer spent defending myself or trying to salvage what was never meant to be nurtured. I reconnected with the parts of me I had neglected. Friendships, passions, small joys. I explored yoga again, not as an obligation or routine, but as a sanctuary for mind and body. I laughed freely, cried freely, and allowed myself to exist without judgment. I was learning that healing isn't linear. It is messy, emotional, but ultimately liberating. The lesson I want to share for anyone watching is this: do not ignore the subtle signs. Do not excuse manipulation disguised as humor. Do not allow someone else's strategic cruelty to dictate your worth. Standing firm in your truth is not arrogance, it is self-respect. Walking away from a relationship that diminishes you is not failure, it is courage. As I sip my coffee, sunlight spilling across the table, I feel ready. Ready to live authentically, to love wisely, and to embrace life on my terms. The past has taught me that my value is inherent, not negotiable, and that true partnership is built on respect, honesty, and shared integrity. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe love will come again, maybe not. But one thing is certain, I will never compromise my worth for performance, manipulation, or humiliation again. I am Catherine, whole, powerful, and free. And for anyone out there questioning their path, remember, the storm may be fierce, but the calm that follows is stronger when you stand in your truth.